Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tales, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The rain had been falling since early morning, not in a rush, but in a patient rhythm that seemed to echo his heartbeat. Each drop found its way down the cracked roof of the old station, down the rusted beams, and onto the concrete floor that smelled faintly of moss and time. The air was cool, touched with the scent of wet earth and distant pine. A faint mist drifted between the tracks, softening everything, even the ache that sat quietly in his chest. He stood there, beneath the iron canopy, a thin figure in a dark overcoat. The brim of his hat was damp, the edges curling slightly. In one hand, he held an umbrella, though he had not opened it. The drizzle did not bother him anymore. It was almost comforting, like an old companion that came and went, but never truly left. His other hand rested on the bench beside him, fingers tracing the peeling paint, as if reading a memory. Across the tracks, the station sign swayed gently in the breeze. The letters had faded, but he knew them by heart. This place hadn't changed in years. The same flickering yellow lights. The same clock that was always a minute slow. The same soft hum of the vending machine that no one used. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening. The sound of rain on metal, the whisper of wind through the waiting hall, the far-off rumble of a passing train that would never stop here. All these sounds had become part of him, woven into the rhythm of his days. People rarely came to this station anymore. Sometimes a traveler would pass through, glancing at him curiously, a man who seemed to belong to another time. But most days, it was just him and the rain. He wasn't sure when waiting had become his habit. Maybe it was on that gray afternoon years ago, when she had smiled at him across the platform and promised she'd return. Or maybe it was later, after the letters stopped coming, after the silence became a season of its own. He looked down at his watch, still working, still steady, though it no longer mattered what time it was. Trains came and went, days passed, the world moved quietly beyond the station. Yet here, everything stayed the same. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the worn edge of paper, a small envelope, soft from years of being folded and unfolded. The ink on it had long faded, but he didn't need to read it anymore. He remembered every word, every curve of her handwriting, the way she wrote his name as if whispering it. The rain thickened for a moment, drumming harder against the tin roof before easing again into a tender ribbon. A sparrow fluttered onto the rail, shook its wings, and flew away. He smiled faintly. There was something beautiful about how life continued, how even the smallest things carried on without question. The world didn't stop for anyone's longing. It simply rained. And so he waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for anymore. A train, a ghost, a memory. Perhaps just a sign that it was all right to stop waiting. But until then, he stood there, listening to the sky fall softly over the earth, and the steady beat of rain that blurred past and present into one quiet, endless afternoon. That evening, when the last train had passed and the station lights dimmed into their nightly amber glow, he walked back to his small rented room across the narrow street. The rain followed him there, tapping gently against his umbrella like a familiar friend, refusing to say goodbye. The room was modest. A single bed, a small wooden table, a chair, and a lamp whose shade had yellowed with age. Yet it carried a kind of quiet comfort. He hung his damp coat on the wall hook, set his umbrella to dry by the door, and lit the lamp. A warm pool of light spread across the room, chasing the shadows into corners. On the table sat a chipped teapot, a cup, and a small jar of honey. He filled the kettle with rainwater collected from the roof gutter, a habit he'd picked up years ago, when he found that tea brewed with it tasted somehow softer, purer, as if touched by the clouds themselves. As the kettle began to hum, he leaned on the window ledge and looked out. Across the street, the station platform was still visible through the rain. A lone lamppost cast its light onto the puddles, turning them into trembling mirrors. The distant rails gleamed faintly, stretching into darkness. Steam curled up from the teacup as he poured. The scent of chamomile drifted through the air, delicate, slightly sweet. He stirred in a drop of honey and watched it swirl like liquid gold, catching the lamplight. Then he sat down, hands wrapped around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the hills, low and tired. He listened to it fade, then to the rain's steady whisper against the window pane. Every sound seemed to echo from a memory. There had been another evening, long ago, a night very much like this. They'd sat together in a cafe not far from the station, both holding cups of tea that had long gone cold. The power had flickered in and out from the storm, and she had laughed softly, saying she liked it that way. The dark, the rain, the small circle of light around them that felt like the whole world. He had loved that sound. Her laugh, like something bright cutting through the gray. He remembered the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the reflection of the streetlight on her face, the way she said goodbye that night, as if she already knew she wouldn't come back. He had written her a letter afterward, not a long one, just a few sentences about how the rain reminded him of her, how the world felt quieter without her voice in it. But he never sent it. The letter remained folded on his desk for weeks, until one day he placed it in an envelope and carried it with him, to the station, to the cafe, to everywhere he went. And it stayed with him year after year, the words fading into the paper like footprints erased by time. The tea had cooled by the time he set the cup down. He stood, opened the window slightly, and let the rain's breath enter the room. It carried the scent of wet leaves and soil, the perfume of the night. He closed his eyes and let it fill him. A quiet exchange between him and the rain, as if both understood something the world had long forgotten. On the midstand beside his bed, there was a small photograph, worn at the edges, colors faded to sepia. It showed two figures beneath an umbrella, smiling. He didn't remember who had taken it. Maybe a passerby, maybe the world itself had paused for that moment, framing their laughter before it drifted away. He touched the corner of the photo and smiled. The rain would fall again tomorrow, and he would go back to the station. Some things were not meant to change, and maybe that was all right. He turned off the lamp, lay down, and listened to the rhythm of droplets on the window. Soft, steady, eternal. It was enough to carry him into sleep, into dreams where the station lights still glowed, and a voice whispered from the other side of the rain dot. The next morning arrived in shades of gray. A soft mist curled above the roofs, carrying the scent of rain-soaked soil and the faint hum of waking life. He woke slowly, the kind of waking that feels like surfacing through layers of quiet. The first thing he heard was the rain, still falling, but lighter now, as if tired from its long night. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and glanced toward the window. Droplets traced lazy paths down the glass, merging and breaking apart again. Beyond them, the platform stood empty, the rails glistening like silver threads stretching toward nowhere. He smiled faintly. The world had its own way of staying faithful, to its rhythm, to its rain, to its quiet mornings. He brewed tea again, moving with unhurried hands. The ritual was simple but grounding. Boil the water, warm the cup, steep the leaves. There was comfort in repetition, in the small, predictable acts that held the edges of his solitude together. After breakfast, he put on his coat and hat, folded the old letter back into his pocket, and stepped out. The rain greeted him with soft applause, tapping on his shoulders, his hat, the umbrella. He finally decided to open at the station. Everything looked the same. The benches glistened. The vending machine hummed. The old station clock, still 1 minute behind, ticked like a heartbeat in the distance. He walked slowly along the platform, watching puddles ripple as he passed. In one corner, a small flower had sprouted between the tiles, its petals trembling under the drizzle. He crouched down for a moment, touched it gently. It was fragile but alive. Somehow, it reminded him of her, not the memory of her face, but the feeling she left behind. He sat down on the same bench as always, umbrella resting beside him. The sound of the rain wrapped around everything like a thin, comforting blanket. He took out the envelope, ran his thumb along its edges. The paper had grown soft with time, but he could still feel the weight of the words inside. He wondered what she might be doing now, if she ever thought of him, if she still liked the sound of rain. He pictured her sitting by some other window, maybe far away, with her own cup of tea and her own silence. Maybe she had found peace long before he did. A distant horn broke his thoughts, a freight train passing through. The ground trembled slightly. He watched it blur past, all metal and motion, carrying lives and stories beyond his reach. Then the sound faded, leaving behind only rain and emptiness again. He leaned back and closed his eyes. There was something almost sacred about this waiting, as if the act itself had become a form of prayer. He wasn't asking for her to return anymore. He wasn't asking for anything. He was simply listening, to time, to memory, to the quiet truth that lingered in the rain. A gust of wind pushed through the station, carrying with it the smell of coffee from the small shop nearby. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman, waved when she saw him. She had known him for years now. Sometimes she'd leave a cup of tea by the counter for him. Even when he didn't ask Dot, he walked over, thanked her with a nod, and sat by the window inside the shop. The warmth was gentle, the glass fogged from the steam of fresh brews. Through it, he could still see the platform, blurred, softened, distant. He sipped the tea. The sweetness of honey and the bitterness of leaves danced together on his tongue. He thought about how life was like that, the way bitterness made the sweetness real, the way loss made love linger longer. When he finished, he walked back out, returning once more to the edge of the tracks. He didn't know how many years he had been coming here. Enough that the rain no longer felt like weather, but memory itself falling from the sky. He stayed until the evening fog rolled in, folding the world into mist. Then, as the lamps began to flicker on, he whispered to the empty air, "Maybe tomorrow," and smiled. Night returned softly, as it always did in that small town, without drama, without sound. Just the slow dimming of light, the rain deepening into rhythm, and the quiet sigh of the station settling into itself. He sat once again in his favorite corner of the platform, coat pulled close, umbrella leaning nearby, a thin curl of breath visible in the cool air. There was something about nights like this that made time dissolve. He could not tell if he had been there for minutes or years. The station light glowed like a distant moon above his head, throwing a golden pool onto the wet ground. Beyond that, the darkness stretched, endless and kind. He thought of her again, not as she was, but as she existed now in memory. The way she used to tilt her head when listening, the way her laughter sounded more like music than sound. There was no sharp pain in remembering anymore, only a soft ache, like the echo of something beautiful. He took out the letter again, unfolded it halfway, then stopped. He didn't need to read the words to know what they said. He remembered the shape of each sentence, the trembling of his hand when he wrote it, the silence that followed when he never sent it. He had written about the rain, of course, how it made him feel less alone, how he wished she could have heard it with him one more time, how the world seemed to slow down in its presence, and in that stillness, he found her again. Sometimes he imagined her returning, not in a dramatic way, not with apologies or tears, but quietly, stepping off a train that no one else noticed. He would look up, and she would be there, smiling the way she used to, her coat damp, her umbrella dripping. They wouldn't need to speak. They'd simply walk together through the rain, as if no time had passed. He smiled faintly at the thought, then exhaled, letting the fantasy drift away like smoke. The truth was gentler, and he preferred it that way. Some loves were meant to stay in memory, pure because they were unfinished. A train passed by without stopping. Its headlights sliced through the mist for a moment, illuminating the raindrops like falling stars. He watched until it disappeared into the dark, leaving behind only a trembling quiet. He leaned back and looked at the sky. It was a heavy quilt of clouds, soft and infinite. Somewhere behind them, the moon must have been shining, patient as always. He imagined her looking at that same hidden moon, somewhere far away not in his room. Later that night, he lit a candle instead of the lamp. The flame flickered and danced with the wind sneaking through the window cracks. He placed the letter beside it, unfolded this time. The ink was faded, but he could still read enough. He whispered the words softly, not for anyone to hear, but because they sounded different when spoken. Warmer, realer. Then he folded it again and placed it inside his journal, between pages filled with sketches of the station, of umbrellas, of rain, his own little world on paper. He drank his tea slowly, feeling the warmth fill the empty corners of his chest. The sound of rain outside became slower, gentler, almost sleepy dot. When he finally lay down, he felt no restlessness, no longing, only a sense of being held by the rain, by time, by memory itself. Outside, the station light flickered once and went out. The rain continued, steady and tender, whispering to the night that everything, even the waiting, had its own quiet purpose. Morning came shyly, wrapped in silver mist. The storm had gentled overnight, leaving behind only the soft patter of drizzle that kissed the earth like an afterthought. The man rose before dawn, as he always did, drawn not by habit, but by something quieter, the need to be present when the world was still half asleep. He brewed tea, the familiar sound of boiling water filling the silence of his room. The faint scent of wet wood and rain drifted in through the open window. He poured the tea into his chipped cup, watched the steam rise and disappear, then took a slow sip. The warmth spread through him, patient and kind, like the morning itself. Outside, the streets glistened. Puddles reflected pieces of sky, small fragments of light that hadn't yet turned gold. He stepped out with his umbrella, though the rain had almost stopped now. Only a few drops lingered, falling from rooftops and the branches of soaked trees. When he reached the station, it was empty as usual. Only the quiet hum of power lines and the occasional creak of the platform roof kept him company. The air smelled of iron tea and the faint sweetness of wet leaves. He sat on the bench and waited, though he no longer knew what for. Waiting had become his way of breathing, slow, even, faithful. He reached into his pocket, touched the letter, and smiled. It felt lighter now, as if the words had already found their place somewhere beyond paper. A small bird landed near his feet, hopping through a puddle. Its feathers shimmered faintly, catching the morning light. He watched it tilt its head, drink from the water, then take flight, a soft blur vanishing into the gray sky. He looked up, following its path, and felt something loosen inside him. It wasn't sorrow, not anymore. It was release, a quiet recognition that all things eventually return to where they belong. The rain to the sea, the wind to the hills, and love to memory. He stood and walked toward the edge of the platform, his reflection rippling faintly on the wet ground. In the distance, he heard the low hum of an approaching train. He watched it come closer, the sound growing, the rails trembling. But when it arrived, he didn't step forward. He just stood there, watching as it passed. A rush of movement, a flash of faces behind fogged windows, lives in motion. When it was gone, silence returned, softer than before. He exhaled long and deep, then turned his gaze to the horizon. The clouds were beginning to lift. Through them, a thin beam of sunlight spilled across the rails, warm and gold, touching everything it could reach. He took off his hat and let the light fall on his face. The warmth surprised him, gentle but steady, like a long-forgotten promise being kept out in that moment. He knew he didn't have to come here every day anymore. The waiting had served its purpose. It had taught him to listen, to remember, to forgive himself for all the words he never said. He placed the umbrella on the bench, the same umbrella she had once left behind, and pressed a hand to it for a moment, as if saying thank you. Then he turned, walking away from the platform, his steps slow but certain. The sound of rain followed him only faintly now, fading with each step. The air smelled of beginnings, damp earth, soft wind, distant sunlight dot as he crossed the street. He glanced back one last time. The station stood quiet in the mist, timeless, almost tender. And though no train would ever bring her back, he felt her presence in the gentle rhythm of the world, in the hush of rain, the warmth of tea, the calm between heartbeats. He walked on, not toward an ending, but toward a day that felt lighter than any before. And above it all, the rain kept falling, soft, eternal. Forgiving Dot in the days that followed, the rain came and went like breath. Sometimes it was heavy, clattering against rooftops and turning the narrow alleys into shallow rivers. Sometimes it was nothing more than a mist, a tender veil that softened the edges of the world. Through it all, he carried on quietly, as though the rhythm of his life had finally found its melody. The first morning he didn't go to the station felt strange. He woke at the usual hour, reached for his coat, and paused. The sound of the rain outside felt different that day. Not a call, not a reminder, but a song. For a long time, he just stood by the window, listening. Then he made tea and sat at his small wooden table, watching the steam curl upward in lazy spirals. He realized that he didn't feel the pull to wait anymore. Something had shifted, not suddenly, but gently, like dawn easing away the dark. The waiting had been his way of holding on, of keeping love alive through the act of remembering. But now, remembering had changed shape. It was no longer a wound he kept open, but a quiet warmth that lived inside him. He still passed by the station sometimes. He would stop near the gate, look at the empty benches, and smile to himself. The umbrella he'd left behind remained where he placed it, propped against the wall near the ticket counter. A layer of dust had begun to gather on its handle, and a small patch of sunlight from the high window rested upon it each morning. It looked peaceful, like something exactly where it was meant to be. One afternoon, as he walked through the marketplace, a little girl accidentally bumped into him. Her mother apologized quickly, pulling her aside, but the man only smiled. The girl had big, curious eyes and carried a small red umbrella. She waved at him shyly before running after her mother. He stood there for a moment, smiling faintly, before continuing his walk. Life, he thought, had a way of returning little echoes of what we once lost, not to remind us of sorrow, but to show us that beauty still flows quietly through everything about at home. He began to fill his days differently. He drew more, sketches of the town, of rain, of the station. His journal, once filled with letters and silence, now carried pictures and small reflections. He even wrote down the story of their first meeting under the rain, though this time the ending was softer. He ended it not with longing, but with gratitude for the laughter, the tea, the memory of umbrellas touching Dot when night came. He often left the window open, letting the sound of rain drift in. The candlelight would flicker, shadows moving like ripples across the wall. He found peace in the small things, The warmth of a cup, the scent of wet wood, the slow passing of clouds. He never forgot her. But the memory no longer anchored him. It floated beside him now, light and kind, a companion rather than a burden. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still hear her voice in the rain, soft, amused, calling his name just once before fading into laughter. One evening, as twilight brushed against the hills, he stood by the window and looked out at the town shimmering beneath drizzle. The station light flickered in the distance, the same golden hue that had once guided him through years of waiting. Now it felt like a lantern for someone else's path. He whispered quietly to the rain, "Thank you for bringing her to me once, and for teaching me how to let her go." The rain answered the only way it knew how, by falling. And in that moment, everything felt perfectly complete. He took a final sip of tea, breathed in the scent of chamomile and rain, and let his heart rest, steady, whole, and light. Outside, the station stood quiet under the soft rhythm of evening rain, its platform empty, its rails shining faintly like threads of memory. Somewhere far away, a train sounded its horn, echoing across the hills. But this time, he didn't listen for footsteps. He simply smiled, knowing some stories don't end. They just fade into rain and begin again in someone else's waiting. Days blended softly into weeks, and the world outside began to change its colors. The rain grew warmer, lighter. The air carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine and wet stone. Spring had arrived, though he only realized it one morning when sunlight slipped through his window in a way he hadn't seen in months. Gentle, golden, curious. He had not gone to the station for a long time. Yet that day, as the sky cleared between showers, something in him felt ready. Not to return to the past, but to meet it where it had always waited. He put on his old coat, now faded at the cuffs, and walked down the narrow street where puddles still mirrored patches of blue sky. The world seemed freshly washed, alive again. When he reached the station, the first thing he noticed was the quiet hum of life. A young couple stood under the same roof he used to stand, sharing a single umbrella. They laughed, bumping shoulders as the girl pointed at something written on the wall. Old graffiti, a name half erased by time. It made him smile. The place wasn't lonely anymore. He walked closer, unnoticed, until he reached his usual bench. The umbrella he'd left behind was gone. In its place lay a single folded note, the paper tucked under a small stone to keep it from flying away. He hesitated, then picked it up. The writing was unfamiliar, delicate, careful. "Thank you," it said, "for leaving this here. I come here sometimes to think, and seeing your umbrella made me feel less alone. Whoever you are, I hope you found what you were waiting for." He stood for a long moment, the note trembling lightly in his hand as a breeze passed through the platform. It felt like a conversation carried across time, quiet souls speaking through simple acts. He placed the note back on the bench, smoothing it gently, and looked around. The rails gleamed in the light. Birds perched on the wire. The world was wide again. He walked toward the edge of the platform, where the view opened into the valley. The hills were still damp, their outlines soft and blue. The rain had left behind thin ribbons of mist that curled through the trees. He closed his eyes, breathing it in. The scent of wet grass, the sound of dripping branches, the pulse of a world that had never stopped moving. He realized something then. The rain had been both his mirror and his teacher. It had shown him how to stay, how to endure, but also how to let go with grace. Waiting had not been a punishment. It had been a way of listening to his own heart until it finally spoke back. He sat there until the clouds gathered again, their soft gray returning to the sky like an old friend. A single drop landed on his hand, then another, and another. Soon the rain was falling once more, slow, steady, unhurried. He smiled and tilted his head back, letting it touch his face. Somewhere behind the station, a train whistled faintly, its sound carried by the wind. He didn't turn to see it. He didn't need to. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for anyone. He was simply there, part of the rain, part of the world, part of something infinitely gentle. When he finally stood to leave, the bench was empty except for the note fluttering softly in the wind. He tucked it into his pocket, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder that every act of healing leaves behind a trace, something small and tender that helps someone else begin Dot as he walked back toward town. The rain followed, painting silver trails on the street. The lamps flickered to life one by one, and the sky dimmed into that familiar, comforting blue-gray he had always loved. He thought of her once more, not with longing, but with gratitude, for her laughter in the rain, for the quiet lesson of love that never needed an ending. Dot. By the time he reached his door, the rain had softened to a whisper. He paused, looked back once more toward the faint glow of the station light, and smiled. The waiting was over, but the rain would always remain. That night, the town slept under a thin mist that curled around the rooftops like a memory that refused to fade. He sat by his window, the same spot where he had watched the rain countless times before, and felt a strange calm settle inside him. The streets were empty, save for the glow of the lampposts shimmering through the drizzle. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then fell silent. He reached for his journal, the one filled with sketches of umbrellas, stations, and letters never sent, and opened it to a blank page. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to write about her. Instead, he began to draw the world as it was now, the way the raindrops gathered on the window glass, the way the candlelight bent through them, turning the drops into tiny suns. He worked slowly, patiently, as if every line were a breath. There was no rush. The world beyond his window seemed to move with him, each sound, each flicker of light keeping rhythm with the pencil in his hand. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the sketch. It was simple, just a window, some rain, a cup of tea, but it felt alive. He smiled and closed the book. Maybe he would never write the ending of his story with her. Maybe it didn't need one. Some stories were meant to remain unfinished, not because they were broken, but because they were complete in their incompleteness. Like a melody that fades into silence before the last note, letting the listener imagine how it might have continued. He stood and walked toward the small shelf by his bed. There, between old books and folded letters, sat the photograph of them beneath the umbrella. He picked it up, brushing a finger over its worn edges. The image had almost vanished, only outlines now, faint ghosts of two people who had once existed in the same light. He placed it back carefully, then lit the candle beside it. The soft flame made their faces shimmer, as though the photo was breathing again. "I hope you're somewhere warm," he whispered, "and that the rain still sounds the same where you are." Outside, a slow wind passed through the trees, carrying the smell of wet earth and the sweetness of night-blooming flowers. He leaned on the window frame, eyes half closed, and listened. The rain was not sad anymore. It was a lullaby, the sound of things returning home. He thought about the umbrella, now gone from the station. Maybe the girl who left the note had taken it. Maybe it was walking through the rain again, sheltering another pair of shoulders, beginning another quiet story. That idea made him happy. The umbrella had served its purpose. So had he. The candle flickered. The air inside the room was warm, touched by light and the faint aroma of chamomile. His cup of tea sat half full beside him, steam curling upward like a spirit ascending. He took one last sip, slow and thoughtful, tasting both the rain and the years behind it. Then he blew out the candle. Darkness returned, but it was a gentle darkness, soft, embracing, full of peace. The only sound was the rain outside, falling in its endless rhythm. He lay down, feeling the sheets cool against his skin. The rain became softer still, like distant whispers. He closed his eyes and let himself drift between the sound and the silence, between memory and dream got in that quiet half-world. He saw the station again, but this time it was empty, golden, and calm. No waiting, no longing, only the gentle presence of rain falling through light. He stood there, smiling, as if to greet an old friend, and the rain, as it always had, answered with kindness. The following morning, he woke to sunlight. Real sunlight, not the shy, hesitant glow of early dawn, but the kind that spilled across the floor in golden pools and made the dust motes dance. For a moment, he just lay there listening. The rain had stopped at last. Outside, the birds were singing as if the whole town had taken a long breath and finally remembered how to exhale. He rose slowly, feeling the stiffness in his knees, the weight of quiet years in his body. Yet there was something lighter in the air, or perhaps it was inside him. He opened the window, and a soft breeze wandered in, carrying with it the scent of wet wood and blooming jasmine. The sound of the river at the edge of town was clearer now, like laughter carried from far away. He made tea, as always, but this time he didn't drink it alone. On the table, beside the cup, he placed the little note from the station, the one left by the girl who had found comfort in his umbrella. He had read it again before bed the night before, and something in its simplicity had touched him deeply. "Thank you," she had written. 2 words. That was all it took to bridge years of solitude. He smiled, stirring a spoon of honey into the cup. For years, he had been the one waiting, the one listening. Maybe, without realizing it, someone else had been listening to him too, watching from afar, seeing his quiet ritual of rain and patience, finding strength in it. The thought filled him with a kind of peace he hadn't known before. After breakfast, he decided to walk. The town was still glistening from the rain, the cobblestones slick and shining. Children splashed through puddles, their laughter ringing down the narrow lanes. Vendors were opening their stalls, their voices blending with the clatter of wooden shutters and the clink of glass jars. He passed the cafe where he and she had once sat together. The sign was different now, painted a soft blue, but the window was still there, fogged slightly from the warmth inside. Through the glass, he saw a young couple sharing a pot of tea, their heads bent close in quiet conversation. He paused, watching them for a moment, before moving on with a smile. Time was gentle in its way. It always filled the spaces we left behind Doc at the edge of town. He found himself drawn back toward the station once more. Not to wait, but to see, to acknowledge. When he arrived, the sun was high, and the rails shone like ribbons of light stretching endlessly into the horizon. The bench where he had spent so many afternoons was empty. The note was gone too, perhaps carried away by the wind or taken as a keepsake. But that felt right. Things didn't need to stay to be real. He stood there for a long while, the sound of cicadas rising from the fields, the smell of sunlight on wet iron surrounding him. Then quietly he spoke, not to anyone in particular, but to the rain that had once held all his silence. "I'm all right now," he said softly. "You can rest too." He closed his eyes. The warmth on his face was gentle, like the hand of someone long gone, but never forgotten. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard her voice, or maybe it was only the breeze through the tall grass beyond the tracks. When he opened his eyes again, everything looked clear. The hills in the distance gleamed, their edges sharp against the sky. The platform, once his cage, now felt like open space. He realized he had been free all along. He just needed to notice. He turned and began walking back toward town, the sunlight following him like a promise. Behind him, the rails stretched on, carrying nothing but echoes and light out at the end of the street. A small boy ran past, holding a blue umbrella, the same shade as hers. He stopped, watching as the boy disappeared around the corner, his laughter echoing down the road. Then he smiled and kept walking, his heart as light as the air after rain dark by late afternoon. Clouds began to gather again over the town, not heavy ones, just the kind that drift lazily across the sky, casting soft shadows over the streets. The light turned silver, and somewhere in the distance, the faintest roll of thunder hummed like a sleepy song. He stood by his window once more, watching the sky darken slightly, and felt the familiar peace return. The rain would come again soon. It always did, but this time he wasn't waiting for it. He was welcoming it, like greeting an old friend who no longer carried sorrow in his voice. The kettle whistled softly, and he poured the hot water over the tea leaves, breathing in the scent as steam curled up like a whisper. He carried the cup to the table, sat down, and opened his journal. The page from last night's sketch stared back at him, the simple drawing of a window and the rain. He picked up his pencil, and without thinking, began to add another detail, a silhouette, a figure sitting by the window, head tilted slightly, eyes closed. Himself. The pencil paused, hovering above the paper. He smiled faintly. It was strange to draw himself, not as the man who waited endlessly, but as the man who had finally learned to be still. Outside, the first drops began to fall, gentle and sparse. They tapped against the window pane like soft fingers asking to be let in. The air smelled of rain and renewal. He opened the window a little wider, letting the coolness seep through the room. He listened. The rhythm was different now, slower, less burdened. The rain no longer filled the spaces of his loneliness. It simply existed beside him, as natural as breath. He thought of all the years that had passed, the empty benches, the unopened letter, the countless evenings spent beneath the steady hum of falling water. It was strange how memory worked, how something once so heavy could become so light, almost tender. He stood, walked to the small drawer near his bed, and took out the letter one last time. The paper was fragile now, its edges worn thin from years of being carried close to his heart. He unfolded it gently, read the words he already knew by memory, then folded it again. With a quiet steadiness, he placed the letter on the windowsill and let the rain touch it, not to erase it, but to bless it, to give it back to the world. The ink blurred slightly, the words melting into one another like watercolors. It looked beautiful that way, as if the letter had finally found the shape it was meant to have. He whispered, "Goodbye," not to her, but to the ache that had lived beside her memory. The candle flickered from the breeze. The sound of the rain filled the small room, surrounding him like a lullaby. He took a slow sip of tea, the warmth resting gently on his tongue, and felt something inside him expand, quiet, soft, infinite. He walked to the door and stepped outside. The street was nearly empty, glistening under the dim light. The rain soaked through his hat and his coat, but he didn't mind. He tilted his head up toward the sky, letting it fall freely over his face. The air was cool. The world smelled alive. He thought about how long he had spent waiting for the right moment, to speak, to move on, to forgive himself. And now, standing beneath the same rain that had once held his grief, he realized there was never a right moment. There was only this one, the one where you decide to let go and breathe again. He laughed softly, almost surprised by the sound. It echoed faintly in the quiet street, blending with the rain, light, and human dot. When he returned inside, the candle had gone out, but the room felt full of light, of air, of life. He sat down once more, took up his pencil, and wrote in his journal beneath the last sketch. Some loves don't return, but they don't leave either. They become the rain, falling quietly again and again until we learn to rest beneath it. He closed the book, set it beside his cup, and listened until the sound of rain became one with his breathing. Outside, the world blurred softly in silver and blue dark inside. He smiled, and for the first time in years, there was no waiting left to do. The next few weeks unfolded in quiet harmony. The town moved gently through its routines, the bakery opening before dawn, the smell of warm bread drifting through the streets. The bookstore next door, stacking new novels in its window, their covers catching the morning light. He had begun to notice these things again, not as distractions, but as tiny proofs that life was always renewing itself. He no longer kept to the same rigid rhythm of waiting. Some days he woke early and walked to the river, where fishermen cast their nets into the mist. Other days he sat by the cafe window with a notebook, sketching strangers, faces, umbrellas, raindrops caught mid-fall. He didn't call it art. He called it listening to the world, to himself, to the spaces where silence used to live. One afternoon, the rain returned after a long stretch of sun. It was a soft drizzle, the kind that shimmered in the light like fine silver threads. He found himself outside without an umbrella, but instead of hurrying home, he stayed under a tree by the riverbank, watching the ripples form on the water's surface. The town looked different in the rain now, not melancholic, just alive. The people who once rushed for shelter now walked slower, their steps patient. A little boy splashed through puddles, chasing reflections of clouds. A woman laughed as she lifted her skirt to keep it from the mud. Everything seemed to breathe together, as if the rain had taught the world how to move gently. He reached into his coat pocket out of habit, forgetting that the letter was gone. His hand met only air, and he smiled. The absence no longer hurt. It was simply a space where peace lived now. He wandered toward the edge of the town where the station lay. It had changed in small ways. A fresh coat of paint, a new sign, the clock finally fixed. The bench where he had waited so many years still stood beneath the same canopy, though its surface gleamed with polish now, as if someone cared to keep it bright. He sat down. The air smelled of rain and oil from the tracks. Trains came and went, their passing no longer stirring the ache of years past. Each departure felt like a blessing, movement, continuation, the world carrying stories forward. Across the platform, a young woman sat sketching in a notebook. Her coat was pale gray, her hair tucked under a soft wool cap. When she looked up and saw him, she smiled, not with recognition, but with the kind of warmth shared between two souls who understand quietness. He nodded back. Nothing was said, but something was exchanged, a silent greeting from one listener of rain to another. When the next train arrived, she gathered her things, closed her notebook, and walked past him. As she did, a folded scrap of paper fell from her hand, unnoticed. He picked it up and called out softly, "Miss," but the sound of the train drowned his voice. She stepped aboard and was gone. He looked down at the paper. It was a sketch, a rough pencil drawing of the station in the rain. And on the bench, under the canopy, sat a lone figure with a hat and umbrella. Himself. He stared at it for a long time, the corners of his mouth lifting in quiet surprise. Then he folded it gently, tucked it into his pocket, not as a token of the past, but as a reminder that stories, even the quiet ones, always find a way to continue through others. The rain thickened slightly, drumming softly on the roof. He stood, turned toward the exit, and began walking home through the mist. The streets shimmered, each lamp reflecting in puddles, like small stars fallen to earth. His footsteps made no sound, only ripples. He felt weightless, as if the rain had washed him clean, leaving only what mattered: breath, warmth, and the steady rhythm of the world around him. That night, before sleep, he placed the girl's drawing in his journal beside his final sketch, 2 pages facing each other like mirrors. Then he whispered to the quiet, It's strange how the rain keeps telling the same story, just in different voices. And outside, as if in reply, the rain began again, soft, endless. Eternal dot the rain came heavier that night, the kind that fills every silence, wrapping the world in its rhythm until even thoughts begin to move slower. He lay in bed, half awake, half dreaming, the sound of rain sliding across the roof above him like the slow turning of time. The candle on his knitstand had burned low, its flame a faint orange heartbeat dot. He reached for his journal, the one that now carried years of quiet observation, and flipped through its pages. Sketches, letters, smudges of graphite, where his hand had rested too long. The scent of old paper mixed with the damp air. Every page was a moment, not grand, not dramatic, but honest. He stopped at the drawing left by the young woman at the station. Even in the dim light, the lines felt alive. She had captured something he hadn't realized about himself. The stillness that had once been sorrow had turned into peace. He smiled softly, touched the edge of the page, and whispered, "Thank you." Outside, thunder rolled gently through the valley, far away, but comforting in its depth. He rose from bed and went to the window. The world outside was silver, rain running down in ribbons, rooftops gleaming under the dim glow of streetlights. The air shimmered with motion, yet everything felt still. He opened the window wider and let the rain's breath in. The coolness touched his skin, waking him fully. For a long moment, he simply stood there, feeling the rain on his hands, on his face, on his heart. He thought of her, the one who had once shared the sound of rain beside him, who had smiled through storms. But the thought no longer carried longing. It was like remembering the scent of a flower long gone, sweet, distant, part of the air itself. Then he thought of the girl from the station, the stranger who had drawn him without knowing his story. How strange, he mused, that connection can flow quietly between people who never speak. Perhaps that was what the rain had always tried to teach him, that we're never as alone as we think. He went back to the table, lit a fresh candle, and wrote on a new page. There is no such thing as waiting forever. One day, you look up and realize the world has been waiting with you until you were ready to walk again. He read the sentence aloud once, liking the way it sounded in the soft air. Then he closed the book and sat back, listening. The clock ticked slowly. The rain softened, as if it too were listening. He poured himself another cup of tea. The taste was gentle, earthy and faintly sweet. He held it close to his lips and breathed in the steam. This had always been his small act of grace, his way of saying, "I'm still here." From outside came the sound of a train, faint, distant, but clear. He turned his head toward it instinctively, though he couldn't see the tracks from here. The whistle rose, low and beautiful, cutting through the rain before fading into the night. He smiled. The sound no longer stirred his chest with ache. It simply belonged to the world, a reminder that somewhere, someone was arriving, someone was leaving, someone was beginning again. When the candle finally burned low, he returned to bed. The sheets were cool, the air heavy with the scent of rain. His eyes closed slowly, his body sinking into the quiet dot in the soft space between waking and sleep. He dreamed of the station, but not as it was. In his dream, it was open and bright, filled with laughter and the soft patter of footsteps. The bench gleamed, freshly painted, and beside it stood the blue umbrella, upright, waiting for the next passerby who might need shelter. He smiled in his sleep. The story had changed, but the rain was the same. Always the same. Outside, the night deepened, and the rain whispered its endless lullaby. Not of longing anymore, but of peace that morning unfolded quietly, washed clean by the long night of rain. The world shimmered. Rooftops glistened. The cobblestones reflected soft light. and the leaves of the tamarind trees trembled under the weight of tiny droplets. He woke to this stillness, a silence so deep it felt like the town was holding its breath. He sat up slowly, the air cool against his skin. The candle had melted into a small puddle of wax, the faint smell of smoke still lingering. He smiled at it. Even endings could be gentle. Outside his window, a faint rainbow curved above the rooftops, so fragile it looked like a brushstroke in the air. He leaned closer to the glass and watched as a flock of birds rose from the telephone wires, their wings scattering the last traces of mist. For the first time in a long time, he felt the pull to go somewhere new. He made tea, as always, but left the second cup empty. Then he packed a small bag, a notebook, a pencil, his old watch, and the young woman's sketch. He slipped it between the pages of his journal and buttoned his coat. The sound of his footsteps echoed softly on the stairway as he descended. The town was waking up. Shutters opening, doors creaking, the chatter of morning vendors returning to the streets. He passed familiar faces that smiled in greeting. The old woman from the cafe waved to him, holding up a loaf of bread still warm in the oven. He bought it, thanked her, and tucked it into his bag. The air was filled with the scent of coffee, steam, and rain-washed air. As he reached the end of the street, he turned left, not toward the station this time, but toward the open road that led out of town. The hills in the distance glowed faintly under the pale sun. The road was still damp, puddles mirroring small slices of sky. Each step felt both strange and familiar, like remembering how to move after standing still too long. He walked slowly, unhurried, as if the world had expanded with each breath he took. The birds followed him for a while, darting through the drizzle that still fell from the trees. The rhythm of his footsteps blended with the faint heartbeat of the rain. Two quiet songs, finding harmony. He thought about how much of his life had been spent waiting in one place, and how perhaps that was necessary. The stillness, the silence, the listening. It had taught him how to see the world not for what it demanded, but for what it offered. Now, as he walked beyond the town, he realized that moving forward was simply another way of waiting, not for someone, but for the next small wonder to arrive. He stopped at a bend in the road where wildflowers grew by the fence. Their petals were still wet, bending slightly under the rain. He knelt and brushed a drop of water from one of them, watching it cling to his finger before falling back to the earth. The world, he thought, always returns what it takes, just in another form. He continued walking until the faint sound of the river reached him. The same river that ran near the station, now wider, brighter, singing louder as it curved through the valley. He sat by its edge, unwrapped the bread, and ate slowly, watching the current move. The reflection of the clouds rippled on the water's surface, soft grays and silvers, drifting. He took out his notebook and began to write, not out of need, but out of quiet joy. Sometimes the heart is a station too, he wrote. Trains come, stop, and leave. Some we miss, some we board. But what matters is that the tracks remain, ready for the next journey, the next rain, the next kindness that finds its way through the mist. He closed the book and let his eyes follow the curve of the river until it disappeared behind the trees. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to go back. The station had given him all it could. The rain had done its work. He stood, brushed the dirt from his coat, and began to walk again. Toward wherever the road chose to lead out above him, the clouds began to gather once more. The light dimmed, the first drop fell, and he smiled, welcoming the rain like a long-lost friend returning home. The road curved gently through the valley, where the hills were still wrapped in a thin veil of mist. The rain, soft and steady, followed him as he walked, a companion without weight, without words. Every few steps, he would pause to take in the view, the glistening leaves, The smell of damp earth, the quiet murmur of water trickling through the grass. Everything seemed alive yet unhurried, as if the world itself had learned to breathe slower. He passed a row of old poplar trees, their trunks streaked with moss, and beneath them the soil was dark and rich. Each step sank slightly into the softness of it, making a muted sound that blended with the rain's rhythm. Ahead, a small wooden bridge arched over a narrow stream. He stopped in the middle of it, resting his hands on the rail, and watched the water slide beneath him, dark, quick, and full of reflections. It was there that he noticed something, a train in the far distance, moving slowly through the fog. Its faint sound reached him seconds later, a low hum threading through the air. He could barely see its outline, but somehow he smiled. There it was again, the endless motion of things, the reminder that even when you stand still, the world carries you forward in its quiet way. He stayed on the bridge for a while, breathing, letting the rain settle on his shoulders. It was neither cold nor intrusive, just there, steady and real. He thought about all the years he had spent listening to rain from behind windows, waiting for answers that never came. And now, here he was outside, part of it. He began walking again. The path led him to a field where the grass swayed gently in the wind. Wild daisies bent their thin stems under the drizzle, and from somewhere unseen, the song of a nightbird floated through the mist. The sound was simple but haunting, like a memory half remembered. He stopped and listened till the rain nearly drowned it out. Then he whispered to no one in particular, "It's beautiful, isn't it?" His own voice surprised him. It had been a long time since he had spoken out loud in the rain. The words felt round, alive, carried away instantly by the wind. As evening drew near, the clouds deepened into shades of violet and gray. The air turned cool, and the scent of the coming night, whetstone, cedar, distant smoke, filled the valley. He found shelter under an old oak by the roadside, and took out his bread and a small thermos of tea. The rain tapped lightly on the leaves above him, forming a rhythm that was both ancient and intimate. He sat there for a long time, eating in silence, watching the shifting colors of the sky. The light faded, but instead of darkness, there came a deep silver glow, the kind that lives only between day and night. Between knowing and forgetting Dot, it was then that he realized the rain had never been about her, not entirely. It had been about the part of himself he had met through waiting, the quiet, patient self who could sit through storms and still find beauty in the gray. He laughed softly, shaking his head. "So that's what you were trying to tell me all along," he murmured to the rain. "That it's not about who comes back, it's about what stays." The drizzle thickened, sliding down from the branches in slow drops. He took another sip of tea, warmth spreading through his chest. The world around him was quiet now, just the rain, the steady breathing of the wind, and the sound of the river winding somewhere unseen. When he finally stood, the night had fully arrived. The stars hid behind the clouds, but their light still seemed to filter through, faint and scattered. He walked down the road again, his shadow stretching and folding beneath each flicker of lightning far away. He didn't know where he was going. Maybe to the next town, maybe nowhere at all. But it didn't matter. The journey itself felt enough. Each raindrop a small reminder that he was alive. That moving forward didn't need forgetting. Only continuing Dot behind him. The rain followed. Soft, endless, patient Dot. And for the first time, he no longer felt like the man who waited. He felt like the rain itself. Falling, flowing, free. Dawn came quietly, dissolving the last of the mist that had kept the valley hidden through the night. The rain had finally ceased, though the air still shimmered with its memory. Drops clung to the tips of grass blades, trembling in the soft wind like tiny stars about to fall. He walked slowly along the dirt path, each step leaving shallow prints that filled with water, the earth sighing beneath his feet. The road led him upward, toward a ridge overlooking the town he had left behind. When he reached the top, he paused. Below him, the station was just a faint shape now, its roof glinting weakly in the pale morning sun. The tracks ran like silver veins through the valley, vanishing into the horizon. It looked so small from here, and yet, for years, it had been his entire world. He sat on a large stone, letting his coat fall open, the wind brushing gently through his hair. From this height, he could hear everything. The distant river, the quiet hum of morning, and the soft creak of trees swaying. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything that had ever mattered. He reached into his pocket and took out the girl's drawing, the one from the station. The edges had curled slightly, the pencil lines faint from moisture. He looked at it for a long while, tracing the outline of the man in the picture, the one who sat beneath the canopy. Waiting Dot then, without sadness, he folded it once more and tucked it between two stones beside him. It felt right to leave it there, high above the station, where the rain and wind could carry it where it belonged. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The air smelled of pine and sunlit soil. The warmth on his face was soft, like an apology from the world for all the years of gray. He thought of her, not as a ghost now, but as a part of everything he saw. The river, the sky, the rain still clinging to the grass. He whispered, barely moving his lips, "I hope you found your way home too." A gust of wind rose, lifting the edges of his coat, and for a brief moment, he imagined her laughter in the breeze, faint but unmistakable. It passed through him gently, leaving behind only calm. He stood, brushing the dirt from his hands, and began to walk again, down the far side of the hill this time, toward a place he didn't know. The sun was climbing, warm and patient. Somewhere below, a train whistled faintly, its sound softened by distance. He smiled, recognizing it not as a call to return, but as a farewell. The path narrowed into a small trail, bordered by wildflowers, their petals still damp and shimmering. Bees moved lazily from bloom to bloom, the hum of their wings blending with the morning air. Everything seemed to pulse with life, fragile, simple, eternal. He walked until he reached a clearing where the grass was tall and gold, bending under the weight of the morning dew. There, he stopped. The light was perfect, gentle but bright enough to turn the raindrops into prisms. He took off his hat, lifted his face to the sky, and closed his eyes. The wind moved through the grass in waves, the sound almost like the hush of falling rain. He stood there, motionless, listening to it. And in that stillness, he understood, the rain was never meant to stay. It came to soften the earth, to clean the air, to awaken the quiet things. Then it left, so life could begin again. And maybe that was love too. He opened his eyes. The world stretched endlessly ahead, open, calm, waiting not for him, but with him. He smiled, a small, tender smile that reached his eyes. Then, with slow and steady steps, he walked on, not toward an ending, but toward whatever waited beyond the hill, where new clouds were already gathering. Promising another gentle rain dot behind him, the folded sketch trembled once, caught by a playful gust, then lifted into the air. It fluttered upward, drifting higher and higher, until it disappeared into the light. The man did not turn back. He just kept walking, beneath a soft, forgiving sky. And somewhere, far above, the rain began again.